German Chancellor Angela Merkel's political future is put to the test. A right-wing anti-immigration party has defeated her party in her home state. So will this change her policy, and what's the reaction in Europe? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme in Doha. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Germany's right-wing AfD party is directly opposed to everything Chancellor Angela Merkel stands for. But it's won the vote in regional elections in her home state. Merkel's popularity is at a 5-year low. She's faced strong criticism for what's seen as her open-door refugee policy. Now, a year before national elections, voters have expressed their disapproval at the ballot box. Can Angela Merkel bounce back? We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Al Jazeera's Dominic Kane sets up the story for us from Schwerin.
A moment of triumph for the AfD. Once they struggled for electoral support here, but now, with an anti-refugee and anti-Islam platform, they're winning votes.
Finally, a real opposition again in Schwerin, and in a year's time, hopefully in the Bundestag in Berlin. And maybe it is the beginning of the end of the chancellorship of Angela Merkel.
The AfD's success has come at the expense of the main parties. Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats were beaten into third place. A humiliation for her in her home state, where the ruling coalition mirrors the national coalition. Her party's lead candidate here was clear what the main issue had been.
The positive political developments that we have achieved here in the state didn't register in the slightest with the population. Instead, there was only one topic, and that topic was refugee policy, even though refugees don't play a real role here politically.
Despite the AfD's success, there is no chance they will enter government because no other party will work with them. The Social Democrats won the most votes and so will continue to form the senior partner in a coalition which will most likely be with the CDU again. Winning seats here means that AfD now has a presence in 2/3 of all Germany's state parliaments and is becoming a force to be reckoned with. The question is whether results like these will change the federal government's policies. Dominic Kane, Al Jazeera, Schwerin.
All right, let's bring in our guests. They're all joining us from Berlin today. Thorsten Benner is the director of the Global Public Policy Institute. Michael Stürmer is the chief correspondent for the German newspaper Die Welt. And Uli Bruckner is a lecturer at Stanford University and a specialist on European integration. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Thorsten, we'll start with you. There was no other way of looking at this result. It was a protest vote, wasn't it?
Definitely. That's also what the polls indicate, that the majority of those who gave their vote to the AfD did so to show to the ruling parties in Berlin that they disagree with the way the country is governed, they disagree with the basic decision on refugee policy, they disagree with the role of Islam in German society, and that's why, and they have their fears on this, and that's why they gave their vote to the AfD, which had a remarkably easy time getting these almost 21% of the vote in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. There was lots of disagreement within the AfD over the summer, lots of squabbling, but that didn't affect them the least. They just had to say, we're anti-establishment, we're anti-Islam, we're anti-foreigners, and they were able to gain 21% of the vote with that.
So Thorsten, there's no danger that this result would be repeated in a national election, is there?
Oh yeah, there's a huge danger that it was a national vote. It was a regional vote, but it was voted on national issues. It will be repeated to a degree in 2 weeks' time in Berlin in the local or in the state elections. And we can be almost certain that the AfD, the right-wing populist party, will enter parliament in the federal elections next September. They're polling anywhere between 9 and 14% right now nationwide. 60% of those polled who say they vote for the AfD say they will do so with certainty in the next elections. That's the highest number among any parties, so you can be almost sure that they will enter parliament, that Germany will become a normal central northern European country. All our neighbors have a right-wing populist force in parliament. They've had that for a long time, and Germany is just normalizing because there was just political space right of the Christian Democratic Union.
Michael, do you agree with what you heard there? Have voters lost faith in the CDU's policies?
There is a lot of distrust and anger, pent-up anger over many months and years, in fact, and also a certain amount of arrogance on the part of the government. The formula, there is no alternative, which Margaret Thatcher used, not to her own benefit, is always too narrow. The Chancellor has, in fact, begun a U-turn, but she didn't communicate. One of her weaknesses, of a few weaknesses, she's a great lady, but one of her few weaknesses is a lack of empathy, a lack of communication. And for politicians in the time of democracy, this is a very serious defect. And it's somewhat ironic that the same woman who 2 years ago was labeled the most powerful woman in the world now is faced with a situation in which there is no happy exit. I'm not so sure that this is normality. It may well be a normality, but a normality which is very, very difficult to handle. Germany has a complicated political structure, not only because of federalism, 16 Länder, every 3 months another election, there's constant excitement in the air, and Germany has been for decades the pillar of stability in Europe, and the CDU has been the pillar of stability in Germany. And all this, in my opinion, is now in danger unless the Chancellor takes a curve and shows more understanding for the little guy. And the little guy has no other means than the elections to show his discontent, and that is the real meaning of yesterday's election in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern.
Michael, her approval ratings are at a 5-year low, but they're still beating everybody else. There's no one to come close to Angela Merkel. But has she become, or is she becoming, an electoral liability for the CDU?
Oh, she is. If you ask the people in the south, in Munich, in the CSU, the so-called sister party, of course she's a liability. And the leader of the Seehofer of the CSU has said so for a long time. It's being said in hushed terms, of course, but it's pretty obvious. And the Chancellor, just a few days more than a week, she gave her summer interview, and she showed no sign of changing course. So, but if she would probably console many of the members of parliament of her own party who are now very, very worried, but don't come out in public because that's dangerous for their job security. But the whole situation is dangerous for their job security.
Okay.
So prepare for a very uncertain 12 months, and after that, of course, extremely difficult coalition, formation of a coalition.
All right. Uli, put this into perspective for us. You've heard what our other guests have to say. Was this just about bloodying the nose of the CDU? Or is it more than that? Have voters in Germany lost faith in all the mainstream political parties?
Well, first of all, it's not only voters in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, but as you said in the beginning, this is a nationwide question that we are discussing, and not only what 1 to 2 million people in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern did yesterday. But I think everything is much more complex and complicated, and that makes it difficult for Merkel to communicate the way Thorsten was referring to as a communication problem. When we look at the issues that the Alternative für Deutschland brought up, they started with a single issue, which was the Greek crisis, the future of the euro, which is a very complex monetary union, architectural problem, that the average observer of the news cannot fully understand, and it's extremely difficult to communicate. The refugee problem has to distinguish between the refugee and the immigration side of it. This has never meant to be an immigration question, but a humanitarian action of the government, which is difficult to communicate if you only see the large numbers of people pouring into the country. But in both cases, in the monetary union as well as in the refugee case, we have a European Union without internal borders, and isolated solutions that a single country could find a solution by its own, by just changing a government, simply doesn't work anymore. And this is extremely difficult to communicate for anyone, no matter if the government is Merkel or a successor.
Uli, the Chancellor's home state has been largely insulated from the refugee crisis. So what are we to make of this sobering defeat for the CDU, which we're told in that state was all about immigration?
As I said, it's extremely complicated to communicate what the long-term strategy should be. Merkel was always referring to a European solution and finds herself being isolated because everyone else in the European Union is either too weak to sign up for a shared solution or doesn't have the same problem in the sheer size of the question, how many refugees need to be integrated, or what is the particular immigration policy of another European Union country. So it takes much more time to find a European common denominator, although the problems will become bigger, not necessarily smaller.
Torsten, what does this result mean for the centre-left Social Democrats who won in the Chancellor's state? Will they be able to repeat that performance nationally?
Well, they're at 22 or 23% of the polls, so they'll be happy if they inch closer toward 30%. But indeed, the leader of the Social Democrats, Sigmar Gabriel, the Vice Chancellor, got another lease of life, if you will, by this electoral win, which was partly also a loss because also the Social Democrats lost 5% of the vote, also mostly to AfD supporters. And he was very composed and confident today on TV, making his statements, saying to Mrs. Merkel that it's not enough to just say, we'll manage. She needs to explain, or everybody needs to explain more how to manage, and also to put more of a social dimension into this, because he said that too many Germans think that whenever banks are to be bailed out, there's money for that. When there's a refugee emergency, there's money for that. But if the school in the neighborhood needs repair, if infrastructure needs repair, if you need decent pensions for everybody, then we're told there's no money, and that needs to change. And that's the message the Social Democrats will be driving forward.
All right, and just before we step back and look at the bigger picture, Michael, I think you wanted to come in there on something that Uri was saying.
Yes, I wanted to say something in favor of the other Europeans. In fact, the Chancellor didn't bother to ask her 16 Ministerpräsidenten, nor did she ask the various heads of government in Europe, and only when it became clear that Germany could not manage entirely on its own, then she said we have to find a European solution. And it's somewhat a magical wand, but the others didn't go along. They said we will not allow Berlin to dictate our refugee policy. And refugee policy, of course, cuts deep into national sovereignty, national identity. And then you are at the very heart of the European architecture. And the European architecture is one of nation states and not of one whole compound that is being steered and directed from Berlin. There the Chancellor had to learn a brutal lesson in the last few weeks.
Okay, Torsten, you wanted to say something there?
It seems to be too easy a reading for me to say that Merkel acted unilaterally, didn't ask anybody. She wasn't the one who created the refugee problem. She didn't invite refugees to come to Europe. They were all over Europe already. There was a humanitarian emergency in Hungary, and she decided for Germany to take in a large number of refugees in an emergency situation temporarily, But it's only natural to then say we need a European solution, because it's clearly a European problem. These refugees are not arriving in Berlin, they're arriving in Greece, they're arriving in Italy, in Bulgaria. So we need a European solution to that problem. So I don't necessarily see much of a diktat on that. It was maybe not communicated as well as good as possible, but for the rest, I think it was inevitable to call for a European solution, because it's clearly a European problem.
Well, let's look at the wider European picture. The Alternative for Germany, or AfD's rise in Germany, mirrors similar right-wing groups gaining popularity across the continent. The National Front in France, like the AfD, is anti-immigration. Its followers are also calling for lower taxes and less business regulation. The Freedom Party in the Netherlands is leading polls ahead of next year's parliamentary elections. It says that it wants to close mosques and ban the Quran. And the Danish People's Party has become the second largest party in Denmark. It's pushing to toughen immigration policies and supports the seizure of refugees' valuables. Let's put a question to Uli on that. How does the AfD, Uli, compare in terms of policies to the National Front in France, the Freedom Party, and Denmark's People's Party?
Well, I don't think they belong to the same homogeneous camp of right-wing racists and ultra-nationalists as we find in other countries. But it's not even necessary in the case of Germany. As Torsten said before, Germany is becoming kind of normal when we compare our political situation with our neighboring countries, because for many years Germany was unique in its not polarized political spectrum, but on a very consensus-based one, which is on the one hand a good thing to see that what the demos wants is actually provided by the government, but at the same time it ignores what's happening on the edges. And that's why it's relatively easy to mobilize protest, no matter what the content is. But when we look at the voters, there's a large percentage that consider themselves to be left. The vast majority of AfD voters see themselves as central, and only a third of the voters clearly indicate that they flirt with a different type of Germany and a more right or even radical form of right-wing political positions, as we find with Geert Wilders or with the Front National in France.
Michael, how do we explain that the popularity of the AfD right now? Why has it attracted so many voters in such a relatively short space of time?
Well, probably there was some protest waiting to materialize, and it hadn't found a channel. Now they have found a channel, and they have found a, well, very controversial leadership, not very convincing people. That's probably the weakest part of this new party. And they have found a government which refused to respond to very serious and in many cases justified concerns. It was an open secret for the last 2 years in Berlin that the German FBI, the Bundespolizei, had warned politicians and the government, especially the Interior Ministry, about what was going to come. And they said very precisely in 2015 we'll have 1 million refugees. Now, instead of preparing computers, centers, entry centers, all these necessary things, nothing was done, and we waited. Instead, and that's even worse, the Europeans, including Germany, cut short the funds for the refugee camps in Jordan, and in the Lebanon. And that really set off the wave of immigration. So it didn't come from a kind of out of nowhere. It was a crisis which built up, and every warning was given to the birds, including from very high places in the intelligence services and in the Bundespolizei. So the management of this crisis has been found wanting in a very serious way. And that is part of the that of course triggered lots of protests because people don't trust the government to find good solutions.
Torsten, how do we explain the shift to the extreme right, or the apparent extreme right of the AfD? It wasn't founded as an anti-immigration, anti-Islam party, was it? It has definitely shifted to the right since its inception.
No, it was founded. It was founded as an anti-Euro party. The first head was an economics professor, and he was very much worried about the trouble with selling out the German D-Mark to the euro and the problems with that project. And it wasn't very successful in the end. In the last federal elections, despite having 2-3 years of euro crisis ahead of it, the AfD didn't enter parliament. It just scored 4.7% of the vote. Then they realized, or a wing of the party realized, it's much more successful if you're the anti-Islam, anti-foreigner party in Germany, because you tap into widespread fear, partly resentment in the population of the changes that are going on with the increasingly public role of Islam in Germany and Europe writ large. Then came the refugee crisis, which of course fueled these concerns and these fears. And the AfD precisely saw there's an opening, and and I don't think, unlike Uli Brückner, who said that they're somehow more respectable and less right-wing, I think they're exactly like the Front National in France and all their other kind of European right-wing anti-foreigner, anti-Islam counterparts. That's what makes them successful. And the only difference right now between the Front National and the AfD is that the AfD hasn't yet adopted a kind of pseudo-left-wing nationalist economic agenda. They have yet to do that.
Torsten, we're rapidly running.
The left party is already worried about this.
We're rapidly running out of time. I just want to ask you very briefly, Torsten, to what extent is this issue of immigration more of an issue in the east of the country? Would the AfD strike a chord, do you think, as it has done at the weekend, with voters in the west of the country?
Oh, they have been very successful in the West. 15% in Baden-Württemberg, in the heartland of Mercedes and so on. So they're also successful in the West. People in the West are also worried. They're a little bit less likely to vote for a protest party in the West because party allegiances run a little more deep because of certain historical phenomena, but for the rest, the AfD is a nationwide phenomenon and bound to enter parliament.
All right. As I said, we're almost out of time. But Uli, I just want to get your thoughts on the performance of the parties on the left, the poor showing in this election of the parties on the left. They're the traditional beneficiaries of a protest vote. Why didn't they get it this time?
First of all, they are part of the so-called Grand Coalition, the SPD, and that is always the weakest position you can have to neither benefit from the positive things the government does, nor can you benefit from organizing protests, what you can do if you are an opposition party. But I think in general, there is still a fear in the country that does not have much to do with facts. Germany has never been more economically successful than it is right now, and that trickles down and it allows a lot of welfare benefits. So it's not an objective situation that motivates people to vote against this or vote against that, but it's a general fear that what they manage to achieve might be at risk because the world is changing too quickly and they cannot really catch up and consider themselves to be potential losers. I think this general feeling motivates people to opt for something which doesn't necessarily need to provide a convincing alternative, but it just criticizes what is wrong in how the government performs.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Torsten Benner, Michael Sturmer and Uli Brückner all in Berlin. And thank you, as always, for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme again at any time just by going to aljazeera.com. For further discussion on any of the issues that we've mentioned on today's programme, go to Facebook at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And don't forget you can join our conversation on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.